All right, well, while we're having the last of our attendees trickle in, I'm going to get started with some of the housekeeping here for our virtual author visit. For any of you who don't know me, I am Catherine Hunt. I'm the director of the Lincoln Public Library, and I'm so excited that you are joining us for this author visit. If you've come to these visits before, welcome back. We're so glad you're here. The next few minutes will be repetition. If this is the first time you've joined us for one of these, this is just going to give you a little bit of layout of what the next hour is going to look like. Our virtual author visit programs are just about an hour long. What's going to happen is Emily Temple, our fantastic author, and I are going to have a conversation about her work, in particular, her novel, The Lightness, Zoom display there, as well as her practice as a writer, a little bit of her work also as managing editor over at LitHub. And then the last bit that we do have is we are going to be giving away 2 copies of The Lightness to attendees to today's event. Those copies are provided by our friends at the Lincoln Public Library, who fund literally dozens of programs here at the library. And if you're curious about what they do and how you can help support the library through them, their website is lincolnlibraryfriends.org. But we're going to give those copies away after the program, because anyone who attends, even if you come in a few minutes late, even if you leave a few minutes early, is eligible for the drawing. So we'll be sending you an email after the program. And with that, I am so delighted to introduce our novelist, Emily Temple, who's also currently the managing editor at LitHub, and whose debut novel, The Lightness, was published in 2020. Welcome, Emily. I'm so glad to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
So for anyone who's coming in cold this evening, because I don't really want to give too much away, how would you describe your book?
The logline that I always used was "Bad Girls at Buddhist Camp." But it's a book about seeking enlightenment in the wrong places and possibly the right places. And it is a book about girlhood and friendships and, finding your place in the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because your protagonist is a teenage girl attending this kind of Buddhist camp for bad girls one summer in her adolescence, right?
Yes. It is a meditation center in the high mountains that has a reputation for being one of the last places on earth where it's possible to levitate. And so these girls get really fascinated with the idea that they themselves might be able to levitate.
Well, fantastic. Would you be willing to share with us a quick excerpt from your book so we have an idea of what your writing sounds like?
Sure. Let's see. I'll just read a little from the beginning. Just give you a little taste. Okay. Also, I always like excerpts that start at the beginning, because then you know what you're getting into. You don't need any discussion.
Exactly.
Once, not so long ago, a woman on the street told me my fortune. She said it was good news. I'd live a long life. I'd be happy, bouncing babies, etc. I was past 30 by then, and I'd had these things on my mind. But there was a catch. Well, isn't there always? You'll never get your good long life if you keep asking the wrong questions, the woman said. I wanted to know which question is the right question. She passed my fingers between her palms, my palms between her fingers. She said, not that one. But I was only teasing her. I knew which question to ask. A suicide, they said, nothing to suggest otherwise. If not a suicide, perhaps an accident, the steep cliff, the shifting rocks. When you see hoofprints in the forest, the authorities said. What would horses be doing in our forest, we wanted to know. Accidents happen all the time, the authorities said. We know you had nothing to do with this. I've found the authorities to be, in some matters, unreliable. The man who drove me up the mountain in the first month of my 16th summer looked nothing like my father. He had thick black hair, a thick red neck, and a rosary wrapped around his rearview mirror. But instead of a cross, a miniature naked woman whose breasts seemed not quite to scale dangled from the coil of synthetic beads. She bobbed in the flow of the air vents, twisted and slapped two-dimensionally against the cheap black cab plastic, and I was reminded, again, of the shapes of women, the impossible geometry into which I was meant to fold myself. I couldn't look at her for long, not because of my own monstrous reflection, which I kept catching in the rear view, also not quite to scale, I thought, but because my stomach was weak in those days. Whenever the car hit a quick dip or banked a long curve, it felt as though parts of my body, throat, liver, one thick thigh, were left hovering, separated, while the rest plummeted or swerved or bumped or whatever. It was a long drive, our trajectory relentless. Even approaching the levitation center is an exercise in anti-gravity, people used to say, and it's true. The center was high enough in the mountains that I felt the air thin out long before I even saw the main building, with its paper white stucco walls, its red-tipped roof, its enormous golden seal. The atmosphere loosened steadily as we drove. I could feel all that nice, thick, sea-level air pooling at my ankles and then abandoning me, even through the churn of the air conditioning. In the end, I spent most of the ride staring at an amoebic mole on the back of the cab driver's neck. That was my mother's wisdom. To combat motion sickness, look unwaveringly at something inside the car, something small and still. If decidedly cancerous, dark purple, spreading out at the edges, no matter. Say nothing. Try not to move your eyes. I know a lot of people who can't remember themselves as teenagers. They look back and see only smoother, pinker versions of themselves, the actual feeling of those frantic years replaced by anecdote and snapshot. Oh, look, weren't we babies? Weren't we thin? Remember the time we, etc. We were so bad. We weren't so bad. Who can say? Me, I can't forget. I remember the girl from that summer as though she were sitting beside me, a fearful girl, but insatiable too, possessed of a fundamental savagery. Well, can we blame her? It had only been a year since her father had disappeared. As soon as I started to become nihilistic about my nausea, the cab crested through a final bend and pulled into a white sand driveway the size of a swimming pool. A woman was waiting there wearing a white dress. She introduced herself as Magda and took my hand as though she knew me. For a moment, I tried to pull away, but she held on tight, and I was unsteady enough in the thin air that I let her. By now, we were almost 8,000 feet up. I was late, Magda told me. I was the very last to arrive. She led me across the driveway toward the center's main building. Paths lined with globular pink peonies scribbled out in the grass to either side, but we didn't follow any of them. Instead, we strode, hands linked, across the white expanse. The duffel bag on my shoulder felt heavy, much heavier than I remembered, and I wondered, briefly, if someone could have hidden something inside of it at the airport when I wasn't paying attention. A hard-packed pallet of powder, say, or a recording device, or the body of a small child. No, don't be silly. That's not what this story is about. Isn't it? Magda began talking, pointing out all the different buildings, the different trails, listing the daily activities, the times I'd be expected for meditation and meals. I couldn't follow any of it. Commissary, dormitory, promontory, bedtime story. I stumbled on a bright white rock. It sparked across the sand like a popping kernel. Magda only tightened her grip. She gave an overall impression of linen and salt. They say everyone faints at least once during their first week at the center before they acclimate to the altitude. Altitude is a perfect word for itself, don't you think? All peaks and valleys and places to slip. But I'd been drinking steadily from my battered canteen, the one my father had given me years before at a place very much like this one, and so I didn't fall. Besides, I was busy looking back over my shoulder. Back over my shoulder, the wind had caught in the loose white sand of the driveway and was coaxing it upward into a steamy funnel. A group of strange-looking girls who had clearly been installed at the center long enough for their heads to become utterly untethered from the old brown world down below appeared as if from nowhere. They yipped and laughed and took turns running through the snow-white mini twister, holding hands, shrieking like children at a water park, coming out the other side with thick white eyebrows and heavy white eyelashes and red, sand-scratched cheeks and instant aging. Magda turned and called out to them, and after a few more furtive whoops and peals, they ran past us toward the main building, sand streaming off their bodies like water. That was 17 for them.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. I really wanted you to read an excerpt because I do think the prose in your novel is so striking, and that's so powerful because your book is written from Olivia's kind of self-aware first-person recollection of this time. You know, she is older now and recalling this summer. And so your language becomes part of how we understand her as a character, because that is her internal life. And I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit about the use of language in your novel and with your characters.
Yes, I mean, I will say that as a reader, I want language and I love language, and I am obsessed with a pretty sentence. And it is just, can't help myself as a writer to try to make that happen. It's the thing that brings me the most joy when I'm reading, is to like come across some like ecstatic sentence or something that is like unusual or beautiful. And so it's sort of always what I'm trying to achieve in different ways. But yeah, I mean, for Olivia in particular, because she is trying to remember this summer, and because she's trying to piece together what happened, she's like worried it over so much. And to me, that's sort of where this language comes from. Because it's almost obsessive, even in even the very language is obsessive. It's minute, it's stopping to focus on words, and it's stopping to say several different terms for the same thing, and it's like obsessing about the colors. And so for me, that I hope that reflects that she has been thinking about this one summer for her entire life, and it has become this almost this jewel-like memory, even as she doesn't understand it, and she's trying to tell her own story in order to understand it. So this is my reasoning for getting to play with language as much as I do in this book.
I think that's fantastic. And I think that's a beautiful thing to kind of describe in what you're saying, that this is a new story for us, but it's not a new story for her, even though she's still telling it. She hasn't gotten to what she needs and telling it to herself just yet. So yeah, so she has had the time to do things like think about altitude and what altitude looks like written as a word. Not what it sounds like, but how it structures on a page. What inspired you to write this, not directly as the events of that summer, but from the position of memory and retelling?
I am interested in the way that, I mean, this sounds very lofty, and I actually don't mean it in this lofty way, but I'm interested in the way that consciousness works. And, this is a book that is involved with Buddhist concepts, and, Buddhists would tell you consciousness is an illusion. But to me, this sort of patterning and stitching together of different memories, different concepts, things that you were reading that day, that is the way we tell stories to ourselves. It's not linear. I mean, this book is like it's not crazy. It's mostly goes forward in a linear fashion, but it is trying to represent the consciousness of someone who's patching things together from different corners of her mind. And so I always wanted to do that now, and to show, because it's like, the way that we read books, it's not, we don't think in these straight lines. We think in sort of in discursive ways. So I always wanted to do that. And in an early draft of this book, I wrote it more from like in the moment, more from her teenage perspective. But ultimately, I didn't want to be limited by what you might be thinking about at 16. And I wanted to think about how perspective allows that patterning to change, and the way your brain works to change. I don't know if that answered the question.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you do that really well in this novel. Some of, I think, the most interesting moments are when we're in the pattern of what's going on in that summer. And then all of a sudden, Olivia, as our narrator, our guide, steps back and either kind of provides distance or rebukes, like, oh yeah, I was 16. That's not how things work. Or even more interestingly, affirms and doubles down on like, yes, absolutely. That is what the world is like when you are a 16-year-old girl and you are in this place, in this moment. And, you know, that's what reality is at that moment to you. There's nothing else. You don't know anything different.
Yeah. And, you know, I think that culturally, and maybe this is getting better, but we don't tend to affirm that worldview of teenagers. And, you know, one of the reasons that I wanted to write about teenagers is because that it's such a magical time. I mean, it's a horrible time in lots of ways, but it's a magical time. You care so much. You're feeling everything so deeply. And, you know, we grow up and we say like, oh, we were feeling it so deeply, but it wasn't real because we were teenagers, but it is real. And so I don't know. I wanted to sort of give my characters that, like, allow them to have that value, to have that reality. And also, she's also going to make fun of herself for sure, because it's, you know, this is how we think. But I guess to give them credit as people.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that's one of the things that really struck me when I first read this novel is, to that point, you know, particularly being a teenager and an adolescent in general, we tend to look back and maybe cringe a little bit. But I think culturally, there's a longstanding tradition that particularly girlhood and female adolescence is something that we write off as being very trite and overdramatic and superficial, and that all those concerns are really overblown. And one of the things that is so striking to me in this book is how vivid and intense kind of the concerns of girlhood. Olivia's concern about weight and the body, and what does a body do in the world, and what does a girl's body do versus a woman's, and her friendships, and how intense and blurred those lines become. You know, those are part of the experience we have as young people very often. And again, I think it's very interesting how you collapse that distance a little bit by taking seriously your characters in those moments, even as we get the distance of Olivia's age at times.
Yeah, both things can be true at once, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. We're still who we were when we were younger. We're just
exactly
all the years in between as well.
Yes. For better or for worse.
For better or for worse. One of the things that I do think is interesting, you were talking about how we think in discursive patterns and kind of associative, is, you know, your book is very upfront about a lot of influences and references, not just literary, though we do see Sylvia Plath, but we have music lyrics like Broken Social Scene. We have references to photography and to films. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those influences and where they come from for you, and kind of how they work for Olivia and our characters.
Yes. So again, I mean, just like, this is probably giving too much of my process away, but it's like, I almost built the perspective around being able to put in all the references that I wanted to put in. So again, like if she's piecing together what happened to her, and of course she's going to use whatever she can. And that's going to be, some of it's going to be what she learned and read about. And, you know, I do use a lot of references, again, because that's how I think. And I think in references, and I feel that, things that are familiar grow in meaning, right? So and I think you don't have to recognize things in this book to have it have meaning, but the same way that, you know, if you see a symbol of like a red bird in the beginning of a book, and then you keep seeing the red bird, it grows in meaning. I'm just extending that from life into the book. And so I'm hoping that people will sort of bring in their own associations, the same way that Olivia is bringing in associations, that she's like, okay, I learned about Saint Teresa of Avila. and she could levitate, and here's what happened to her. And without, what does that say about me? What does that mean for me? And then things, broken social scene lyrics. I will admit that I just put in a lot of things that I loved because I wanted to, someone once asked me what the number one thing that I wanted my book to do. And the answer was create some joy and connection for readers. And it's like, that's what brings me joy is these little mentions. I think there are 2 mentions to Buffy the Vampire, references to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Maybe that was indulgent. But again, this is how we think. It's like, you don't exist in a vacuum, you exist in the world. And so I wanted to make sure that, she's not just looking back at her own life and she only exists in her own life. I wanted her to exist in the world as we know it.
And I think that does really interesting work too, because you do have a very tight location and a tight timeline in this book, and a pretty tight character base as well. And to have these references out into the world helps ground Olivia and the other characters that, this is summer camp. It is a microcosm, and it does get that little, to use a TV reference, almost bottle episode feel that I think a lot of us who've been to camps remember and recognize. But, she is still a teenager with music tastes or things like that. There is this fabric of the world that she's not able to shed, no matter how kind of focused her experience at this camp becomes.
Yeah. And no matter how much, Buddhism wants you to shed all of these things, it is part of, they can't really, they are creatures of the world. And so that is part of it too. They have too many tentacles to really achieve nothingness.
That is the trick of attachment, is that, it's everywhere and to everything.
Yes.
So as you mentioned several times, this does take place at a Buddhist camp, and more than it just being the setting, the questions in Buddhism are something that Olivia's wrestling through the whole thing between desire and abstention from it and release. Can you talk a little bit about bringing all of that into this novel?
Yeah. So I was, I was raised with Buddhism. So my father was a follower of the same Buddhist teacher that the Beats were, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And so I was raised with Shambhala, which is the kind of Buddhism that he brought to the West and really invented for the West. And so, and I have had a complicated relationship with it. But what I wanted to do was give Olivia a complicated relationship with it as well. And I basically wanted her to have the same in this, and really in only this way do I consider it autobiographical, is that she has the same relationship to Buddhism that I did, which is that she learned about it through osmosis, that she doesn't know anything really about it. She's not like Serena, who reads the books. She has not been to the college classes, which is how a lot of people learn about Buddhism. She just has heard it sort of in her, periphery, that it's important to her father. And so, so I tried to really stay true to that. And I tried not to do any research until I got to the end of the book. So I was really, so I have, people have said to me, like, this isn't quite right. And I'm like, yeah, I know, because she's wrong. Like, she doesn't quite know. And this is how that's how it is at that age. You, you're piecing it together, and you're sort of going off, as the kids now would say, vibes. Like, so I guess that was a place where, as I was writing, I really wanted to maintain sort of the reality of not having it be too studied, having it be sort of like filtered through memory. but I also found myself going down weird paths and finding out new things ultimately. So it was pretty interesting just from a writing perspective for me to do it.
That's really fascinating to hear. And I think that that's one of the things that in reading this novel that I enjoyed was the sense that Buddhist thought was threaded through so much of this, that Olivia is wrestling with it, but it never feels like an explanation of Buddha. It never feels like a college textbook with the synopsis of it, which I feel like sometimes is the pitfall that really bringing in a fully conceived of philosophy into a work of art can do to it. And I do think it makes it very powerful, because I feel like there's times looking through where you see Olivia kind of leveraging the parts of Buddhism she understands to already reinforce things that she wants to do or believes, which I think we all do with our life philosophies.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you say that, because, it's sort of interesting working with Buddhism, which, there are plenty of novels that draw on Christianity and use Christianity in different ways, and in America, it's a more widely known and practiced religion than Buddhism. And so it was interesting to work with Buddhism and think, like, how much do I need to explain? How much can I assume, what I don't know what readers know. And so that's sort of why I landed on this, like, we're just going to go with, like, I'm just going to present this sort of watery half knowledge, and hope that everyone will follow along with their own watery half knowledge, because everyone knows something, but it's not as much of a cultural surety that you'll have, like, a working knowledge of.
Absolutely. Did you find with your editors that they pushed for you to share more or less of the philosophy, or did they really trust you on telling that story, in terms of what the audience would be able to latch onto?
They mostly trusted me. I think I was asked to put it. There is a short, like, 1 or 2 page sort of origin, like, explanation, basic, here's who the Buddha is, that I think I was asked to put in, just as, like, here's a basic primer. But other than that, I think, yeah, they just let me go off on my own journey.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I do remember that up in the beginning. There's the 1 or 2 pages telling the story of the Buddha, and kind of how that extrapolated in.
But I tried to make it, mesh, so it didn't just seem like, here's a textbook page for you.
Well, at the end, you have Olivia's memories of her father being like, but we don't know if that's actually how it happened.
Right.
Right. Like, that's the story.
Gotta undercut it.
Yeah. And lay that groundwork for what you were saying, that Olivia then is going to use what she understands as she understands it, and not go to the library and, check her sources a second time.
Right.
That kind of leads into something that I found really interesting. There was a line, I read your book when it came out in 2020. I reread it before our conversation today. And one of the lines that really stood out to me when I was rereading it is, there's a moment where Olivia's looking at, I believe it's Laurel's photographs pinned to the bed. And she reflects that, I have it written in front of me, I don't just have it memorized, but now I know, of course, how easily photographs lie. Or maybe that's not right. It's not that they lie exactly, it's that they invent their own realities. And in rereading this, it seemed to encapsulate to me so much of what Olivia does through the novel, that she's creating realities around the pieces that she knows. From what we've been talking about today, Buddhism, you see it with her relationships to other characters. She hears the stories that are being told about Luke and builds a reality and a story around it. We see it with Serena. And, she acts according to, which kind of makes its own reality. But I'm wondering how much in that, as you're writing it, you're holding a tension between kind of what a neutral observer would say are the real events and who these people really are, and Olivia's building of this story.
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think I want to say yes. So I think there are the real events, but I want to say that no, I want to say there are no real events, that everything is perception and everything is Olivia's building it. I mean, yes, in the world of the novel, like these things actually happened. And some version of them happened. But, you know, it doesn't really matter. And I think one of the questions that the novel is ultimately asking is this question of, does that objective reality matter? And can we ever know what it is? Because without giving anything away, this becomes a sort of very specific question of like, can we trust what we've seen? And not just can we trust what we've seen because we've got an unreliable narrator, but can our narrator doesn't trust what she has seen. And she has what she wants to believe, and she has what she thinks she believes, but it's just not certain. So yeah, I don't, is there a tension between, yes, I think it's, or at least we strive for it to be sort of a similar tension to the one that exists for all of us, in life of if I mean, this is a very undergraduate thing to say, but like if I put a red umbrella on my porch and I say that's red and you agree with me that's red, we have no way of knowing that our perceptions of red are at all the same. We just know that they're relatively the same, but you could be seeing, something entirely different. And I feel like that is particularly true in teenagehood, and particularly true when you're looking back on it and remembering it. So yeah, I guess unfortunately what I'm saying is there is no reality anywhere.
Which, I mean, Buddhist thought would hold is true.
Right. Very Buddhist. Yeah, there we go.
No, but I do think that's interesting. Because like I said, assuming there's a neutral observer, there is no neutral observer in the world. But, there are interesting points, I think, in all our lives. And it shows up a couple times in the book where, not to give anything, but I'm thinking of a moment with Olivia where her perspective on a character seems to change very quickly. And this person is no longer who she had kind of been thinking and acting as they were earlier. And I think those moments are very disconcerting for us because it's a sense that we didn't perceive the world previously the way we are now. And I think a lot of times we frame that we don't perceive the world the way it is. And yeah, I think that's really unsettling. And holding that tension of how do we do that is really interesting in your book for your characters.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely unsettling. I mean, and I think it causes a lot of problems, actually. I mean, when because we reject it, I think it's human nature to reject it. And it takes a lot of effort to have your worldview be subverted and then think like, okay. And yeah, but you're right. There is no neutral observer in the world. There's nobody, unless it's going to be AI. So maybe that'll be our neutral observer.
Maybe, but even AI will make up things if it doesn't know the answer, which I think is the most fascinating part of that. But that's a whole nother rabbit hole to go down. But speaking of that with unsettling and tension, my feeling of your novel is that so much of this is about tension. This isn't necessarily a book that jumps forwards and leaps and bounds with a fast-paced plot. We don't have a traditional hero's journey from beginning to end. You argue it. I feel so much of what happens is the tension and Olivia living in tension as we head towards, this in the passage that you read right at the beginning. We know something happens that's tragic at camp. We don't know if it's horses or zebras, but we know something happens. And I'm wondering how you navigate that, tension as kind of a structuring device as a storyteller and a writer.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost down to a line level. I mean, I try to put tension in every line. I am not a plotter. I know a lot of people do elaborate plots. That's not the way I work. I work in mood. So I'm trying to create sort of these small tensions and these small plots within scenes, and also within, again, sort of the plot for me is her mind working. Then there's plot. We're hanging there's the bad thing that happens, and we like go there and we come down. But yeah, I mean, thinking about every moment and how to make it feel like it's vibrating. That's that's really how I approach it. And thinking of it more as like a constellation of stars with vibrations between them. This sounds very heady. A constellation of stars with vibrations between them, as opposed to a roadmap that you're just following along dutifully. So to me, it's that pull between all the stars, and then and it can be just making sure that anywhere it can tug, we have it tugging. Mixed metaphors.
I think that's one of the stars over. I think that's one of the most gorgeous descriptions of making a plot work that I have heard. So thank you for that. And then I hope everyone listens to that is inspired with that. If you're not a plotter, that there is such a beautiful image for a way of building that isn't, how do we get from point A to point B first, and we'll decorate it. We'll decorate around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can do anything. That's the truth. You don't have to do point A to point B or the hero's journey.
The more authors I get to converse with, the more I have come to realize that there is absolutely no one way to create. There's no one story to tell, and there's no one way to get there. And I think that is absolutely fantastic and makes me so happy we live in a time in which there are so many ways to access so many people's work.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is a little bit of my segue out of your actual novel into some of the other literary work that you do, because you are managing editor at Lithaven, correct? Which is a beautiful, amazing website that helps highlight so many fantastic books. And I'm wondering how that has influenced you as a writer.
Well, first of all, it has just influenced me as a writer because I read so much. I read for a living, and I write about books for a living. And so in a way, this novel is a love letter to everything that I've ever read. Because as a little kid, I grew up obsessed with books, and, I just never stopped being a huge nerd. But I will say that as a writer in general, I've been working for almost 15 years in online, like, arts and book media, and being able to, writing quick daily blogs or listicles or essays or interviews for the internet has really taught me it's almost like I can hear the music of how something should sound in my head, because I've just repeated the same song so many times. So I can get to the end of something without holding on to it too tightly. So it has taught me to keep moving through, because when you're writing something for the internet, especially in the bad old days of like real blogs, you just get through it and press publish. And so I learned to let go a little bit. And obviously you don't let go when you're writing a novel, you edit it 1,000,001 times, but being able to move through is really important. And so it taught me to move through. And it taught me to trust myself that, what I wrote is going to be acceptable. But I would say most importantly is just the number of, like, as you said, just the number of different writers and styles that has exposed me to.
I think that comment about moving through is so important. I always think it's fascinating. National Novel Writing Month, and its focus on just get the draft out. Just write 50, move through it, just write 50,000 words and realize that the world doesn't end, and it doesn't matter if it's terrible, and it's probably not as bad as you feared. It's also not as good as you hoped, but it's definitely not as bad as you feared.
Yeah.
I think it's powerful.
Sorry, what?
Go on. And I think it's powerful.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I teach creative writing workshops, and one of the things that I tell my students is just get to the end once. They're all working on novels, and we're workshopping, the first chapter or a chapter from the middle, and they want to know like what to do. And this is the number one thing that I tell them is get to the end once, because once you get to the end, you can see the whole thing. And if you don't get to the end once, you're going to polish those first 3 chapters for the rest of your life. So this is my best advice.
Get to the end once. And I can totally see that you do get caught up in those first 3 chapters and making them beautiful, but do they go anywhere? Right. And if you even keep them if you got to the end of your whole story, because
probably not, you're going to cut them. Yeah.
Yes, kill your darlings. That unfortunate advice. That's so much does not make it into the final piece that had to be there as part of the creation.
It's true. I have the graveyard file for the Lightness is twice the length of the finished book. Everything that I cut in the process of writing it is twice as long. But it's not a book. It's just stuff.
It's just fluff. And I guess I'm wondering, like, do you feel like all of that was necessary to get to the final piece? Or do you think some of it you're like, oh, I could have gotten those 2 weeks back?
I think a lot of it was necessary. I think a lot of it was me doing just what I said and working passages just into oblivion, just because I didn't know where I was going, and I wanted to work on it, and that's where I could put my energy. But you can tell sometimes you work something to the point where you break it. And so some of the stuff in that file, I went back to previous versions. I went back to the simple version, because I had just it was tortured. But a lot of it had to happen. And a lot of it, I cut a lot, but it was always my promise to myself that the next time I read through the draft, if I miss that thing that I cut, I can put it back in. And the thing is, I almost never missed it. A couple times I would put it back in, but you almost never miss it, because when you cut it, that it needs to be cut, even if it makes you sad.
It's time for it to go, even if you still love it as a piece of writing, just not as this larger piece of writing. Yeah. Well, we're at 45 minutes in. I just want to remind our attendees that if you have any questions that you would like Emily to answer, please drop those in the Q&A of Zoom. You can reach that at the bottom. But otherwise, Emily, you were saying that you read for a living, that you get to read all the time. And so I'm wondering, what have you been reading lately? Is there anything you'd recommend?
Oh, yes. So many things. But unfortunately, or fortunately, the best 2 books that I've read so far this year are both over 600 pages. One of them is a debut novel by a Swedish writer named Lydia Sandgren. The book is called Collected Works, although it is not itself collected works. It's a novel. And it's this just wonderful book about a failed novelist and his marriage and his kids and his best friend who becomes a famous painter. And it is, they all live in Gothenburg, and it's hard to explain, except that it's just a book about art and life and friendship in the biggest, it's such a juicy novel that it just is really pleasurable to read. So I would recommend that book. And then a book that I have read in advance, which is coming out in August, is Paul Murray's The Bee Sting. He is the author of Skippy Dies, which some may have read, also a wonderful novel. But The Bee Sting, similarly, is a big, juicy family novel that has, I won't even say anything about it except that it has the best ending that I have read in years. And I just think everyone should read it and then email me so we can talk about it. Because I want to know what happens.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Yes. And that's one we'll be keeping an eye out at the library. So if you want to read it in August, come check out the library. We'll have a copy. And in light of all our conversations of memory and recollection, is there anything that you read and loved as a teenager that you would recommend?
Now it's hard for me to remember how old I was when I read things.
Teenager-ish. It feels. It has a vibe of adolescence. We'll go with it.
Yeah, see, the book that I think of instantly is I was probably not a teacher. It was probably like 12, but the book of my childhood is Patricia C. Reed's Dealing with Dragons, and the series that follows, which is I just remember the first one opens, Linderwald was a beautiful kingdom, all of the, it's like this whole paragraph about how wonderful this kingdom is and how beautiful the castle is. And then it says Cimmerian hated it. And it's about a princess who runs away from the castle to become a dragon's princess. She lives with this dragon and organizes her Latin library and makes her Cherry's Jubilee. And all the other dragons have princesses that they've captured, and princes come and rescue them, and princes keep coming to try to rescue Cimmerian, and she's like, no, thank you. So this was a very formative book for me. I know it's old hat now to have the cool princess with a sword, but at the time, I had never read anything like that. And similarly, it takes in all of the fairy tales and sort of twists them and references them and uses them for its own ends. And so, I may have picked up something from that. So that book is just, I would recommend to anyone with adolescent girls, but boys too.
Oh, that's fantastic. I too remember reading that book as a young person, and as a young person with a perfectly lovely and comfortable and delightful life who, had decided that no, it was terrible and I wanted to run away and also know dragons.
Mm-hmm, of course.
I think it speaks to a certain brand of childhood who, that dream that there's still something else out there.
Yeah. And right. And then you're disaffected and then you come back to being just affected.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's take a look. I don't currently have any questions in the queue, so I'm going to do this as last call for any questions. Yeah, Emily, thank you so much for joining us. Again, in case anyone missed it in all that we've been talking about it, Emily's novel is The Lightness, and we have 2 copies. If you're a winner, we will email you about that after this event. But yeah, thank you, Emily, for coming and talking with us. It's been such a delight talking to you about your book and your process.
Thank you. This was a really fun conversation. I'm so glad to have been invited.
Absolutely. And you can find more of Emily's short fiction and nonfiction writing on her website, as well as you can see what she's reading and recommending along with the team over at LitHub. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful night. And thank you again, Emily.
Thank you. Good night.